Dear participants, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, whatever your time zone is. My name is Arseniy Zhilaev, and today I will be moderating our talk with Terry Smith. Welcome everyone on behalf of the Higher School Sreda Obучения, the learning environment. And today we are meeting within the framework of the cycle Meetings Outside Borders, which is an international project of the faculty and the school Sreda Obучения, inviting artists, curators, philosophers, and theoreticians from all over the world. The lecture started on October 5th and will last until November 9th. We've already met with Zdenka Badanovets and with Franco Bifo Berardi. Today, our speaker is Terry Smith. On Tuesday, you'll see David Joslit with Yegor Safronov as moderator. I'll start with some technical information and about how this meeting will be conducted, and later I'll introduce Terry and give him the floor. We are to listen to a lecture for about 50 to 60 minutes. You may write down your comments and questions in the chat. And then we will have about 30 minutes discussion. I will ask a few questions on my behalf, and some questions will be taken from the chat. So please do write your questions, and we'll try to discuss all the matters of interest. But unfortunately, we won't have time for everything because our time is limited. As for myself, I can say that Terry Smith is a very important and interesting figure, a theoretician and practitioner of contemporary art, both for myself and the Russian context in general. Not so long ago, his second publication in Russian came out, which is a book of his interviews with the most important curators, which was published and translated by Ad Marginem. Today's lecture will be about curatorship and the open strike, curating the complex and the open strike. That's the name of today's talk. And this meeting will follow his new book, Curating the Complex and the Open Strike, published by the MIT Press. We'll be happy if this book is also translated into Russian. We are now talking about this with our colleagues from publishing houses, which might be interested in the works of Terry Smith. I think it would be an important input into the shaping context of contemporary art in Russia. But the book is not translated yet, and some of us don't have access to it, and so we can listen to a brief presentation of it. Let me introduce Terry and say a few words about him. He is a professor of contemporary art history and theory in the Department of the History of Art at the University of Pittsburgh, and professor in the Division of Philosophy, Art and Critical Thought at the European Graduate School. He's also lecturer in the curatorial program of the School of Visual Arts in New York. In 2010, he was named the Australia Council Visual Arts Laureate and won the Mother Award for Art Criticism, conferred by the College Art Association in the USA. During 2001 and 2002, he was a Getty Scholar at the Getty Research Institute. In 2007 and 8, Senior Fellow at the National Humanities Research Center. He also worked in the Institute, in the Clark Institute, Then he was professor of contemporary art and director of the mm, Institute Foundation for Art and Visual Culture at the University of Sydney. And what's important for me particularly is that in the 70s he was a member of the Art and Language Group in New York and founder of Union Media Services. He's also author of several books, notably Making the Modern Industry, Art and Design in America, Transformations in Australian Art, The Architecture of Aftermath, What is Contemporary Art, published in 2009, Contemporary Art World Currents, and Thinking Contemporary Curating, which was published in Russian. Uh, as far as I believe, it was the first book published by Garage, which was dedicated to debating contemporary art. Also, Tolkien Contemporary Curating, the Contemporary Composition, 1 and 5 Ideas on Conceptual Art and Conceptualism, which was not published in Russian, but it includes a brilliant article theoretizing on conceptualism, namely Moscow conceptualism. Um, there was a symposium conducted by Boris Groys 10 years ago, and Terry was also part of it, as well as many, many other publications. His foundation board member of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney and board member of the Carnegie Museum of Art and a member of the advisory board of the Biennial Foundation. Today's lecture will follow the new publication on curating and will give us a brief overview, a mapping of contemporary curatorship and what Terry calls curating the complex of exhibition halls, museums, and various roles that contemporary spectators of contemporary art take. And it will also be dedicated to an interesting idea of the open strike in the territory of contemporary art. Perhaps that is all for now, and I'd like to give the floor to Terry Smith, and an hour later we'll be back to you. Thank you.
I can be heard. Okay, I should start speaking. Okay, thanks very much. Wonderful to be introduced by Arseny, because we have a very high regard for his art and what he's done as a contemporary artist. That's well known throughout the world and much appreciated. I'm very pleased to be able to speak at your university and to you, to students of curating, of contemporary art, and anyone in Moscow or anywhere in Russia who is listening. I've visited a couple of times. I've really enjoyed it. I've also been pleased that my books on curating have been translated. In fact, I only just learned today that the second book had been translated. So that's terrific. What you'll hear, in fact, is a talk that is from a third book. It takes the process a little further. But just to be a little bit formal, I should also mention that I'm speaking from Sydney in Australia. I'm speaking on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. That's the Indigenous people who still own Australia, even though settlers such as myself and my family have arrived later. So I acknowledge their elders, past and present, and emerging. Okay, so I've been asked to speak to you today about the ideas that I'm presenting in my small book, which will come out in about a month from now. It's published by Sternberg and by MIT Press. It's called Thoughts on Curating. It's part of their series, as you see, Thoughts on Curating, edited by Steve Henry Madoff, who's the head of the curatorial program at the School of Visual Arts in New York. It sort of follows up the Thinking Contemporary Curating book that Arseny has mentioned. In that book, I tried to profile the discursive or the reflexive aspects of curatorial practice as I understood them. In other words, I tried to picture the theories that I thought curators were using in their work to theorize their own practice, although it's actually quite rare for a curator, or at least it was rare for curators to theorize their practice at that time. Now it's much more common. So that's really good. I was delighted that it was translated into Russian. I was very pleased to come over and talk about the book at Garage some years ago, and we just heard about the other one. The second book, just translated, includes interviews with a bunch of people who at that time were known as star curators, like Oakley, my dear departed friend Oakley and Wazel, whose published writings I'm actually editing into 2 volumes that will come out in a year or so. Also Hans Ulrich Obrist, Carolyn Christoph Bukaviev, Boris Groys, many other people, but including curators who at that time were not very well known, such as Zoe Butt, who was the main active worker, if you like, at San Art in Ho Chi Minh City. So that spectrum is really important, as you'll see as we go along. So doing those 2 books, I realized that one thing I hadn't done or hadn't been done was to map the context of curating. So thinking, talking, mapping the practices. So there's thinking, talking, and practicing, but there's also what are the contexts? How do you map those contexts? And also this particular series, Thoughts on Curating, is intended to be read by students of curatorship or curating and anyone interested in it. So putting the 3 books together, that will be enough from me on curating, I think, for a lifetime. But anyway, there you go. That's what they'll be. So that's the context. And I'm going to give you a picture of that in this talk. So let's go to the core work of a curator. So I think the core activity of a curator is to exhibit works of art. That seems obvious. To curate them into exhibitions and to make visible the exhibition value that Benjamin alerted us to. The artworks have an exhibition value in and of themselves, but they have a surplus exhibition value when they're put together with other works of art in ways that the person who made them may not have anticipated. So that's where the curator becomes creative in generating, as Oakley said, this surplus value, the surplus exhibitionary value. So today, that occurs in contexts that are absolutely extraordinary in number and variety and density and complexity and their global spread. The contexts are much bigger than what can be encompassed by a concept such as the art world. That's a 60s concept, made sense then, doesn't make much sense now. And I think we can learn a lot from Tony Bennett, the sociologist, Tony Bennett's idea of the exhibitionary complex, which he thought of as a kind of parallel, if you like, to the military-industrial complex. So the exhibitionary complex is the definitively modern public sphere that was created and sustained during the 19th century in Europe and the United States by museums of different kinds, art museums, history museums, natural science museums, sustained by recurrent public spectacles such as dioramas and panoramas, by national expositions, by the world's fairs, but also exhibitionary complexes included shopping arcades and department stores, entertainment zones of cities, and even central squares. You know, central Moscow is an exhibitionary complex, obviously. Most central cities are exhibitionary complexes. And then publicity itself, advertising in all its forms. So exhibitionary value is absolutely spreading, and he mapped it in a very important way. The only thing that I've added to this is a thought that perhaps we could anchor the way we think about curating and what curators do. We could anchor a description of the complex in which they work by talking about the venues and the formats, the places where they curate exhibitions, where exhibitions are made. And these are the things that I call the visual arts exhibitionary complex. So this is what you're seeing on the screen now. We'll come back 3 or 4 times in this lecture. Don't try and read it all, but take a screenshot, although you'll also, everyone registered will get a copy of this PowerPoint, so you'll be able to look at it in detail. So this is what I call the visual arts exhibitionary complex, as I said. It varies from city to city, from region to region. It's in perpetual flux. Very few cities have the entire range of venues that you see on the screen here. But some cities have many variations of 1 or 2 types, or of many types. You know, the great imperial centres, such as London, New York, and St. Petersburg, for example, those centres have many, almost all of the kinds of exhibitionary venue or format or place that you see listed here, or at one time or other had them all. They vary. Sometimes they have more than one, as I said, of each. So many of these institutions arose in response to perceived shortcomings of already existing ones. And so while art worlds tend towards constant internal division, they're like cells that reproduce small differences. The relations between all these places and parts amount to a network through which ideas, objects, and people flow. And so as the venues that are listed here are the kind of the hardware of the complex, the myriad relationships between them constitute its ecology, the ecology of the complex. Now, of course, we'll come back to this and I'll talk more about it in a minute, a few minutes, but within this complex, the Universal History of Art Museum takes pride of place. For example, I'll just give you, I'll come back to that. I'll give you some examples from New York. The kind of Universal Art History Museum, the classic example is this jewel box museum, such as the Metropolitan. Of course, it makes available to people in a kind of democratic principle. It implies that anyone can enter this facade through this imposing edifice, but in practice, it's only people who see no barriers to entering them that do in fact go in there. Inside, you'll find artifacts from past civilizations exhibited as works of art, along with modern and sometimes contemporary art. But these palaces of art are surrounded by many other kinds of museums, for example, museums of modern art, more specialist museums, museums of contemporary art, which in a way is a kind of contradiction in terms, but nonetheless, they've been around long enough to become museumized, to get new buildings and indeed to get expansions. As you may know, the new museum is going to get another spectacular building right next to the current one on the right-hand side of that. And in New York, you can go through the whole spectrum till you get to places, groups such as 16 Beaver, who are a group of artists and activists, or art activists, who have been operating really now since the I think around 2010, they've been active, I think 29 or 10, very active in both doing exhibitions, but also creating reading groups and interventions of various kinds. So you have a huge kind of spectrum of images, a huge spectrum of platforms and venues throughout the whole. Okay. All these smaller scale spaces are kind of adjacent to the museums that we spoke about before, who really are based around their collections and drawing exhibitions out of their collections. Most of the other places I've just shown you for example, don't have collections. They're organized around activity, um, activities of various kinds. Um, as well, as you would have seen back on the main diagram, there's obviously a crucial center around the commercial market itself. And there's also, as well as that, all of these venues, whether they're central or adjacent, they have online sites, mostly devoted to preparation or following up to a visit to the actual physical plant. But some of these online sites have become quasi-exhibitionary venues in themselves. And during COVID, of course, they were the main and almost only venues for most of the art world. Had to transpose itself into this virtual space and hope that will sustain attention for the period when we're meant to be able to conquer the pandemic, if we ever will. Okay, so going back to this main list here, we can read this list in a bunch of different ways. First off, at least 4 of them. We can read this as an historical sequence. It's indicative of the key moments of change that have occurred in the history of art during the modern period, and heads towards the kind of diversification that is typical and splintering that's typical of contemporary art and contemporary life. So if you go up to the top left-hand corner, in fact, the very first museums were private collections that were open to limited publics. And then they gradually, this was in the 15th, 16th century, they gradually took on the form, particularly after the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, they took on the form of being universal history of art museums. In other words, the 18th century idea that aesthetics could apply universally and could apply to any object that was decided to be beautiful enough could be absorbed into an art museum. So that's the anchor, as I've said, is the whole thing. That's where the history of what of the exhibitionary complex really takes off and is basically anchored in property in key cities and then in smaller cities throughout the world. But you can read your way through this, and as we read through the development of commercial and dealer galleries, a small-scale development next to the museums, and then gradually becoming its own central focus of activity. Biennials, I'll come back to a bit later. Kunsthallen also, they appear in the you could argue in the late 18th century, but they're really a mid 19th, late 19th century operation by Kunstvereine, artists associations, and so on in many countries. And they've become, in effect, spaces within multi-arts activist collectives. I'm thinking of Ruin Gruber, for example, here, and I'll come back to them. And then there's all the kinds of public art activity in public, art made for publics, commissioned artworks in the public, but also lots of art that goes on in public domains that are not professional ones. Okay, so there's that history that we can see there, but also we can look at this page and we can think to ourselves, in any given city, the people with the most power, the most money, the most influence are the people in the art world gathered around the main museum. And then secondarily around the commercial galleries and the auction houses and so on and so forth. And then the relative power within the local art world is distributed and dispersed until it almost kind of disappears down below. So this is a power structure. It's a structure about cultural power as well. That's the second way of reading this diagram. And curators, of course, have got to be aware of all these things as they go about their business. The third aspect, and for the translators, I'm now on page 4, paragraph 3rd. The third aspect is that even though every institutional form drags towards institutionalization, every social form that lives for any amount of time will institutionalize itself eventually. Every one of these elements doesn't remain a pure expression of its foundational purpose, right? Most of which would double anyway. Um, each has an internal dynamic which animates it. Every single element on this list has some kind of internal dynamic. For example, all art museums are driven by a contrary pull between preserving their collections and showing new art as it's made, or giving you a new perspective on art of the past. It's a dynamic of the slow but infinitely accumulating time of the permanent collection that's on display vis-a-vis the faster changeover of the temporary exhibition rooms. Okay, so that's in a classical museum. A modern museum is driven by the pull between its desire to narrate the history of artistic modernism, or more accurately, some selected histories of modernism, through its long-term displays on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to collect and show contemporary art in order to stay relevant. So museums of modern art are split in that regard. Museums of contemporary art devote enormous energy to behaving as if they were Kunsthallen or contemporary art spaces. And so both modern and contemporary museums struggle daily with the dilemma of becoming inevitably historical as everything accumulates. So that kind of dynamic and double internal energy is also very, has to be registered and taken into account. And the fourth way of reading this whole complex is in fact as a complex, to see it as a network in which there's incredible interaction between all the parts. So, for example, artists operate as curators at various times. In fact, the interaction between artists and curators has probably been the most important dynamic within the whole history of contemporary curating, I would say. And in fact, the books talk about that, particularly the Thinking Contemporary Curating book talks about that. It's also the case that individuals might begin as very young art graduates. They might curate in their art school. They might curate in an artist space or not-for-profit space and swear to have nothing to do with museums for their entire life. A little bit later, they might get a job somewhere in a contemporary art museum, and then eventually they might become director of a universal history of art. That hasn't actually ever happened yet, but it should have happened to, say, Oakley and Ways or someone like that. But in other words, the interaction between the parts, the mobility of the actors within the network is really crucial. Okay, so again, we'll come back to that because I've got a couple more things to say about it before we finish. But in the book, I also map lots of other changes that are relevant to curators and the history of exhibiting. And I won't go into them in detail, but I'll just show you this one because you can read these as in the same way. You can read them historically, 15th century all the way down. You can understand that gradually the ones that last the longest become the most powerful. The new ones are created often in reaction against them, and they become institutionalized, and so it goes on like this. So that's a pattern in Europe. You can follow, if you're writing a history of exhibitions and the nature of exhibitions, this is what you'd follow, this kind of line. Okay, and what you'd see is a movement such as this. I'll just give you some examples. As a private collection, as a public display, as well as being private. The so-called white cube, which rarely is ever purely white, but nonetheless it removes information from around the artworks, removes the collective from the center of the whole project. The center collector's down here, there he is down there. He's no longer the center. One person's taste is in the center. It's meant to be an objective narrative of the history of modern art as achieved by the artists, driven by the artists. That's the dream. And then there's a creation of sort of multimedia settings for the showing of art, as you see at the Pompidou, as you move into sort of late modern art practices, more postmodern ways of exhibiting art, as you see in the Wexner Centre, exhibiting late modern art, such as David Smith, as you see below, in settings that themselves start to interact with the artworks as quasi sculptures, quasi sculpture settings. Media, new media settings, which are really ways of projecting virtual media in various forms. At ZKM, it's done in a fairly classic fashion most of the time. And then an effort to design open plan museums that don't, as it were, predict what's going to go inside them. Don't even offer themselves as museums in the sense, and this one opens itself to the light on the outside. So this is the museum that kind of tries to disappear as opposed to a museum that tries to be an artwork, like Frank Gehry's museums do. So you can see this interplay that I'm speaking about. In this case, the format or the venue, the place for showing becomes exhibitionary in itself, either by overstating itself, imposing itself too much, one might say, or trying to disappear itself is another way of approaching the same problem. And this is one example of a kind of museum that thinks, a building that thinks and thinks about time in quite an interesting way, just recently completed at Virginia Commonwealth University, just opened last year. In fact, it got delayed for various reasons. And what you're looking at here is a museum on a plot that's on the intersection at the Virginia Commonwealth University, is all the way around the back of the building here. And this is the city here. So this is, as it were, the main entrance to the university. And they've basically put an entrance into the building here. Whoops. An entrance into the building, which you see up here, which as you go into the building and here, gives you an option of going straight ahead into rooms, going up into rooms, in fact, in two different directions. So it actually splits, it gives you down below one direction, in fact, two either side, and upstairs two directions. So time in 4 parts. And the different tracks are the tracks for what I call first current contemporary art, remodernizing official contemporary art. The second floor includes work that comes mainly from outside Europe and America, Africa and Asia and elsewhere, a kind of post-colonial, what I call transnational art in transnational transitionality. Other people call it post-colonial or decolonial practices. And thirdly, art that's art that's of the third current, what I call the third current, which you can't actually name, doesn't have a name, but it's a series of practices based on mainly using virtual media or immaterialities of various kinds, working with time itself in various ways, and working collectively and interactively in the way contemporary art is moving at the moment. That's encompassed in the third tendency. The So there's an image of the front of the museum, as you see, and the back of the museum, which has projections towards the back and goes into a garden of contemplation or a thinking garden where you look at, and that connects with the university. So just an instance of a museum that actually thinks about these temporal processes, the bigger and more complex temporal processes that are going on. Okay, there's also, you can look at types of exhibitions. And again, this is a simple thing to do, to actually just list the sorts of exhibitions that people, curators take for granted. Collection, private, and again, it follows that history, and also it's about power and so on and so forth. So I won't speak about these. These are just things that the curators amongst you can come back and have a look at, something you know very much already, but things that are taken for granted by curators. Now, coming back to this main thing, I just want to draw your attention now to something I haven't really brought out properly, and that is that there are, sorry. There are 5 clusters or constellations here in the top left-hand corner. The core of this is museum practice, collecting and conserving and maintaining a temporality that is slow, historical, and permanent, that will hopefully go on forever in one way or another. When you look at commercial galleries and dealers, what's crucial there is the temporality of selling a work of art when it's seen. And that's all that counts. Selling the work is all that matters for a deal. I mean, everything else feeds into that and supports it, but temporality is the point of sale. Totally different as a core value from the museum values in the first set. I'll come back to biennials in a minute. Kunsthallen and all the artist spaces are artist driven. They're driven from inside art itself, not the history of art, but the practice of possibility of making new art, of making art as it's art as it's made, art that's to come, art that's appearing. And public art and all the other stuff that you see there is about the general public ongoing interest, the non-official, non-art world, general interest in art that most people have of one kind or another. The aesthetic sense that almost everybody has in one way or another. And it doesn't necessarily move them enough to give it form, to give that form. So if you then go back to biennials for a while, I could speak about them throughout. This is I won't. To just say that it's obvious that something was needed to operate on a temporality different from the long durée, the long history of the museum, from the point of sale, instant point of sale of the marketing system, from the process of creation that artists go through, and they seek other artists to work with to exhibit their work when they don't want to go through the museum or the market and the public thing. What biennials do is offer the energy of the artists and the Kunsthalle and the Artists Association, all that creative energy. They offer that every 2 years for a certain period. So they create a kind of infrastructure that is like that of a museum or a gallery, like a temporary exhibition in the museum or gallery. They also offer a point of sale most of the time. So in other words, biennials have, I think, been so successful, and this idea only came to me yesterday, by the way. Biennials have been so successful because they somehow have encapsulated the elements of all the other parts of this entire exhibitionary complex. And then, of course, they've done that on a world scale. They've done it in a way that links the local to the international. In other words, the art that's here to the art that's usually made elsewhere, the art that's been bought here. So they have a spatial, an ability to condense a very complex, widely distributed spatial structure into one place. They have an ability to condense all the temporalities of all the other four different points of energy within the complex into themselves for a short amount of time. So they can be, for countries that don't have a lot of infrastructure, they can be an example of what it would be like to have a lot of to have an exhibitionary complex. They're an example of what it's like to have an exhibitionary complex for a couple of months. So you can see what it's like and decide whether you want to build one in your own city. Anyway, there's lots of things one could say about it, but that's a thought that may be of interest to people. That there's 5 different kinds of energy that are within the complex. They are both spatial and temporal. They're also psychological. They're to do with the kind of nature of the creative energy of the people involved. And what they generate is this amazing infrastructure in which you have actors of different kinds who keep this whole thing going. And then in brackets, I'll put a couple of things, private collections that operate between the museums and the commercial or dealer galleries, and between them and the biennales and the artists' organisations, who of course the artist studio and the workshop of the collective. They're exhibitionary spaces, but they're not public ones. All the other ones are public. You know, an artwork first appears in an artist studio or a workshop or collective, or some usually, and but that's private. It becomes public, and curators get involved. By curators are the people who make things make art public. They're the first. They're the frontline workers of making art public in various ways. Anyway, okay, so a few more points because I think we've got, let's see, another 10 minutes or so, because I want to get on to the open strike, which I will in a minute or two. But just quickly to bring out the fact that we're looking at a system that could sound and look fairly abstract, but obviously it's immersed in the world, and there are many examples of inequality involved. I'll give you the extremes differences of inequality. This is an extreme example of enormous wealth concentrated obviously around a real estate development, which brings the world's leading star architects to produce variations on art museums that are going to be full with very large works of art, mainly from a first and perhaps second current artist, but who knows. This is an extremity, not just of concentrated wealth, but of imitation, of trying to imitate and import a visual arts exhibitionary complex, because behind the museums that you see down on the water's edge, there are museums servicing and educational facilities and universities, and trying to train all the actors of a visual arts exhibitionary complex to service all of these museums. So it's importing imitation at a high extreme of wealth. So that's, if you like, one end or top of the complex in outside the West version of it. And then another version, quite the opposite, is what Ruin Group has been doing. For 15 years, almost 20 years now in Jakarta, and these little sheds and places that it has, creating exhibitionary spaces, basically teaching in a good school, teaching locals all kinds of different art practices, evolving them as they go along, very connected with the local music scene, lots of poster work. Nothing, it's developing, if you like, an alternative perspective on how to create an exhibitionary space, a space to generate an art that's also an activist practice. And it's quite a remarkable, wonderful thing, I think, that Ruan Grupa was invited to be the curators of the next documenta. And they only just yesterday announced the artists who they've invited. And virtually all the artists invited are artists who work in collectives or work independently or work kind of critically. At the further reaches of the complex and on the edges and in and out of this exhibitionary complex all the time. So I'm fascinated to see how each of those artists will be able to operate in Castle itself, in the spaces of Castle, and whether they'll be able to transform the exhibitionary space of Documenta, which itself is an extraordinary place, in a significant way. Okay, so in the last part of my comments, and I'd like to talk about the kind of deinstitutionalizing energy that in fact Ruan Grupa is bringing to one of the great institutions of the international art world. Because in fact, the whole lecture, if you like, has been about the dialectic between institutionalizing and deinstitutionalizing. A dialectic that actually never resolves itself, never turns into some kind of happy synthesis. It's much more a kind of, dislocated, shattering, deconstructive operation that goes on. Thank heavens, thank God, because that's where the energy of art comes from. And one example of that we've been seeing, if you like, to invite Ruan Grupa to do Documenta, the sort of what I call the meta exhibition, or the meta biennale, to invite them to do that is to invite them to offer a kind of model of deinstitutionalization at the center of one of the great art institutions in the world. Although, of course, like all biennales, it's not in a capital city. It's off to one side of the center. All biennales, or most of them, are slightly decentered. That's part of their important energy. So I'll just end with some comments about the open strike, because the open strike, I think, is giving us a model of a different kind of deinstitutionalization, which is becoming more and more political. And the open strike was called by a group of organizations in Beirut in response to the just finally getting fed up yet again with the impasse of governance within Lebanon between the three factions that divide governance and divide everything and mostly look after themselves, and have created this kind of internal vacuum. They've generated a kind of they've recolonized their own country, in effect, which is something that's going on in many countries at the moment. They're kind of, instead of decolonizing or trying to create a post-colonial situation, they've recolonized their own country without bringing in the previous colonizers, although of course they bring in France whenever they need more money. Anyway, so general strike. And what was called by the, as you see, if you can read Arabic, apparently on the right-hand side there, and an image of the strike, this call for a general strike. And I'll just gloss it briefly, because I think it's an absolutely crucial kind of concept, one that's very useful for us to think about today in terms of the art world, and how to keep deinstitutionalizing or re-energizing art world practices. What they did was realize that the business of striking by closing down everything and then joining the political protests, or only having a strike, that's to say joining a general strike, or only having a strike of your place where you worked, which can be isolated, a really important thing to do is to, as they say, maintain the minimum necessary administrative and basic operations. In other words, keep the art space open, and something like 30 or 40 of, in fact, nearly all, I can only hardly think of any Beirut art organization that did not join this open strike. They kept themselves going, they kept doing their work, but most of the staff and the students and the artists and so on went out on strike and did the political work that was needed, or that they hoped, although it hasn't succeeded yet, to change their own society. So it's an innovative way of thinking about striking. If you look on the left-hand side, what you see, all those little green spots, are art centres that were created after the Civil War. If you look on the right, you'll be devastated to know that that's the impact of the explosion in the port in that very same place, which wiped out many art centres. For example, these two. Gallery Tanit is where Walid Raj shows in Beirut. So that's smashed up the gallery he is at. And finally, an example closer to home, or one of my homes in New York, is of course the activity by Decolonize This Place. And so in my next 3 or 4 minutes, just to try and finish by the hour, I'll just briefly remind you, or let you know about the activity of Decolonize This Place. It's been so important in New York lately, following the activities of what we did in the 70s with artist meetings for cultural change and various other organizations that were active at that time. It's sort of disappeared for a while, but re-energized now, particularly through Black art organizations, but coalition ones like this, Decolonize This Place. So asking in the book and museum, in the Indigenous art section, where did this stuff come from? You know, what's the cost? And then deliberately setting out to remove, or try to remove, a man called Warren Candace, who was the deputy chairman of the board of the Whitney, that was showing the Whitney Biennale. And one of the works by the forensic architecture and by Laura Portress, fantastic artist, revealed that his company was producing the gas that was being thrown at the asylum seekers on the borders of Mexico, bullets that were being shot into the legs of the student protesters or the people protesting in Gaza, and so on and so forth. So he was a manufacturer of extremely violent weapons. So they created a campaign to try and bring that to the attention of the museum. Many artists withdrew from the museum. A letter was written signed by lots of art world people, including myself, and so on and so forth. But the campaign is terrific. I'll just show you a couple of moments from it. There they are in front of a Warhol. Week 3, that's what they were doing. By week 3, week 5, occupying the foyer of the museum itself. So we go in there to the elevators. There's smoking. It's not so much gas, it's also an indigenous way of cleansing a place. And eventually, in fact, succeeding. So within 9 weeks, the guy had left and he'd gone. And so just to bring all the elements I've been speaking about together, and going back to remember when I first started speaking, I acknowledged the Indigenous people whose land I'm speaking from. Again, decolonizing, one of the great and most important things to do in terms of decolonization is to remember the land, and to recognize that we're on this land. that is being destroyed by what we call global warming, which isn't an abstract thing. It's something we've created in very specific ways. Um, and that dynamic is operating throughout whatever we're doing. And the kind of future that we're imagining, the futures that we're imagining, have to encompass the fact we've got to deal with that as well. Okay, so I've talked long enough, and I've talked exactly almost an hour. And now we have some time for questions and discussions. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and hopefully we can have some conversation. Yeah.
Терри, спасибо большое за вашу
Thank you very much, Terry, for your great lecture. We now start our conversation part. I think that it is also very important for this context to have the possibility to speak openly, directly to international experts. And in our situation in Russia, you know that we have been in isolation for a long time and in cultural isolation. So, dear colleagues, we are waiting for your questions in the chat, but I will start from my comment, and this is just a remark which is linked to the transformation of the role of an artist or a curator in in contemporary art. I think that with time and if we discuss your books, Terry, we see that the majority part is devoted to curating. We think that with time, from the center of contemporary art production, the person of the artist is going backward, and this is the personality of curator, which is in the center. If we talk about the source of political transformation, at least. Because I have been working with the archive of the ex Goran Georgievich, ex-Yugoslavian artist. He's now the technical assistant of the Museum of American Art in Berlin. When Goran was artist, he was organizing art strike. He sent letters to a lot of important artists from early 80s, and he called to unite against the uh, system of art. And people people had different opinions, and the majority of people refused to take part. But Lucy Lippert or Carla Dre accepted to take part in this movement. But there's another interesting fact. This was a letter from an to other artists. But now we say that the source of transformation and of critics are curators, or in general, the staff working in the exhibitory complex in general are not artists. Do you agree with this understanding? Is really the position of the curator central? And if yes, why?
Okay. So I actually remember that invitation to join the art strike. I remember receiving it within Art Language, and we spoke about it. And it's a translation. There's this very strange, we thought it was a joke, you know. We actually didn't think, what we thought was that here's someone who was making a proposition as a pretty banal piece of, you know, kindergarten conceptual art. Like anyone could do this. It's as if the person who sent it, who we didn't know, and he didn't identify himself as an artist, clearly, if I remember, it was, we understood it to be something which would demean and make less politically powerful the idea of a strike. Okay. So in other words, we actually misunderstood totally what he was talking about. and this art language, the most politically, at that point, the most politically radical art group in the world at that time. More than Hans, I mean, we were the kind of policemen of the art world, some people would say, Michael Baldwin and so on were connected with international socialists. So, I mean, in other words, we were looking for, and how could this connect with an organized political group that actually could create some change? And this seemed like an abstract exercise, right? So what we didn't understand was, and now we understand, looking back through his work, because he's an artist who disappeared himself. He removed the recognition factor of himself as an artist, would only make work as if it was made by somebody else or someone fictional. Just for the people listening who don't know about him, he would be Malevich, like he was Malevich in the early 80s in Slovenia, right? And then he was Walter Benjamin giving a talk, whatever, and they had people present his own artist talks. And so he's a guy who actually had a very thorough a very deep understanding of all these complexes and all these questions that I've been talking about, as well as the histories of art, histories of modernism. And he also understood how vacuous the history of modernism was that was being written within the United States and other countries. It was a sort of empty history, the one being written by the Museum of Modern Art. It was a kind of history that took the politics out of art, He understood that, and he created these rooms that showed us a kind of empty modernism, modernism without passion or whatever it is. So he's a fascinating guy, but the point is, we couldn't see that. So it's an amazing piece of mistranslation. Anyway, that's one. The other answer to your question is, I think that the dominance of curators called star curators, particularly during the 90s, like Hans Ulrich and Seemann, Hans Ulrich, Oakley, Carroll, and so on. So they in fact have been displaced by collectors. In terms of the actual concentrated power in the international art world, auction house dealers, arts advisors. So on that level of, who are the stars, who are setting the agenda of the upper reaches of contemporary art, it's become less curators, particularly in the last few years. If you think about how biennials become much more frequent, but you don't actually hear the name of the curator as much, And in fact, the appointment of Ruben Gruper is a very conscious thing by Uta Medabaya and people like that to actually try and counter the privileging of the curator, So I'm not sure it's going to work, but we'll see. So one also notices, Shani, that many artists became curators, and like I said, the most innovative exhibitions have, in the last years, many of them have been made by artist curators or artists working with curators. Another thing I'd say is that there's a whole younger generation of artists who don't have the star curator approach. They kind of tend to disappear behind an artist and support an artist, support getting the work done, getting the project finished. I've noticed that as well. But it varies depending on where you are. In some countries, it's really necessary for an artist, for a curator, for example, to become very active. I'm thinking of, Gracie Ngumbo in South Africa, who created the Museum of Historical Memory, which was in fact an alternative art space where exhibitions that should have been held in Africa but weren't being held in Africa. She put a version of them on, like the third Johannesburg Biennale. She made the third, which of course didn't exist, but should have happened, in a way, if the infrastructure kept going. So all around the world, there are curators who've understood that there's not enough of an exhibitionary complex in my place to enable artists to make a living and to create art. I've got to go and actually create the bloody thing to give them that chance. Now, so I don't think it's right to say there's artists on the one hand and they're all the one kind, and there's curators on the one hand, they're all the, there's obviously many different kinds of artists and many different kinds of curators depending on the specifics of the situation that you're in. You know what I mean? You yourself have curated kinds of art that is not just promoting yourself, it's about promoting a possibility of practice in your setting. And thank God there are many people such as yourself, and hopefully when I was your age, I did the same thing in Sydney, and and so on and so forth. So that's how I'd answer your question. Yeah.
Спасибо. У нас
Thank you. We have a few questions from the audience also concerning the figure of the curator. A question from Irina. Which personal qualities you think are important for a contemporary curator? And a question from Anna Savchenko. Which of the artists besides Runa Grupa you could name as those that are working with the community?
Oh, okay. So I'm actually, in terms of advice to curators, I'm only doing it because, not because I'm a curator, although I have curated a few shows, but I've just been around for quite a long while. And on that basis, in the Thinking Contemporary Curating book, right at the end of that book, I listed a bunch of points that I noticed that curators had been saying to me in conversations, as if you put notes to yourself. You do kind of post-it notes to remind yourself, how to, the kind of instructions to self, right? And I'll just read the ones that I wrote down in 1912. Let me just read them here. So they were, let's see, exhibit art's work. Exhibit the work that art does, not the object, the work that it does. Exhibit, no. Renounce reticence. Stop trying to disappear behind the exhibition as if you don't exist. Right? Curate reflexively, meaning think about what you do, make it a critical reflexive practice. Build research capacity. No, don't depend on art historians and other people to do your research. Build it yourself and build up archives. Make research possible. Articulate curatorial thinking, because I noticed that very few curators at that time were writing about their own thinking. And I said, archive the achievements. So here was a thing I noticed was very common for curators to, having put an exhibition up. And here's the thing, a curator will only really know in a deep way how works of art are connecting with each other in the exhibition that they've made. They only know in a very deep way about it when the stuff is on the walls or in the space finally, and they can walk around and look at it. You can't fully know what you mean as a curator by having images of the works that you're going to put in this exhibition in your head, or looking at photographs of them and designing it, little, models and stuff. You can only know what an exhibition means when you've walked around the exhibition and you've been in the exhibition. And usually has this extra value and extra meaning that you haven't anticipated. almost no curators until I started yelling at people ever wrote down what that was. So this was crucial knowledge about art that disappeared. And it really depended on a critic coming along and understanding it and writing it down, or an art historian coming down. But the people who had created that meaning, the curators, were not actually recording it or communicating it, right? They're expecting to disappear and let the exhibition do the talking. Well, that's okay. That's one approach, but I found it such a loss. And so I've been glad that many curators now publish a catalogue later, having looked at the show. People come and look at the show and then they write stuff, so we have more knowledge about art. So I think that's important. Anyway, sorry. Reinvent exhibition formats. So Hunter used to say you have to reinvent the format every time you do an exhibition. Right? That's a pretty high demand. That's almost impossible. But turn the exhibitionary complex, meaning the whole complex, shift the whole thing. This is very ambitious, but try and make a change in the whole, not just a little local change, although they're pretty good as well. Proliferate alternative exhibitionary venues, activate infrastructure. At one point I said in public, sometimes it's more important for an artist to create an exhibitionary space for other artists than to make a artwork. In some countries, in some circumstances, that's a more important thing to do. And then a lot of people got angry, but I think that's true in some circumstances. Right? Embrace spectatorship. Curators should think about their public. Don't just put something in front of them and walk away. Who are you doing it for? How are you changing them, their viewpoint? And create contemporaneity in art and society, past, present, and future, critically, meaning think about our contemporary condition and all the complexities of it, and try and make work with those ideas in mind. So, and then a few years later, Steve Henry Madoff, we had this conference in New York, and he created this book called Art Activism. And he said, question, what is to be done in your country, in your political situation, your cultural situation from your point of view? So this is 2012. So I added a few other things, like, for example, understand that the accelerationism of shock doctrine capitalism is a sign that the system's implosion, a sign of that system's implosion and its replacement by an even more chaotic state of affairs. So we're not post-capitalism, we're in sort of, exploded capital, So particularly in the post-Soviet sphere, we've had this sort of, the disappearance of the implosion of the Soviet system. Strikes people from outside, such as me, as having created this vacuum for neoliberalism to come running in, disguised as nationalism, as an old nationalism. So that's a kind of massive recolonization of oneself, against the grain of history and so on, that actually occurred in so many countries. And it's occurring in Africa as well in all sorts of ways. We can talk about it more later if you like. But we've got a situation of, this may be the end of capitalism, but it's something worse, in a weird fashion. Something worse is appearing on a big scale in terms of the larger levers of power. On the lower levels and more specific operations, I'm really encouraged by many different other things, like support the art and join the activism against this regime, work in organizations, again, Ruin Group is an example, but Casco is another one. There are many around the world. In fact, the whole list of people invited for documented 15 to answer the next question, they're all people who, as it were, curate. They're all artists who curate their own critical, political, community building environments wherever they are. So that list is the answer to that question. And this open strike model, a model where you actually keep building, keep engaging with art making and exhibition making, community building and activism, while doing direct public politics as well, and not splitting one off the other. That's, I think, kind of crucial as well. Anyway, I'm adding all those to that list. So that's how I'd answer those two questions. Yeah.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Вопрос меня.
Another question from me, and it is related to the dialectics between the institutional construction, institutionalization, and the construction of the contemporary art environment and deinstitutionalization and the cooperation of the two factors. As general rule, we think that the institutionalization in general brings some dangers and threats, and auto-organization is a positive factor. But I wanted to ask you about the possibility of more strange options. For example, when an institution inside itself creates a de-institutional activity, when new possibilities appear, or when we have some types of auto-organization. As an example, I can quote the museological experiments in the USSR in the 1920s or 1930s, when after the revolution, museums were making some things and they created collective exhibitions and they went above the barriers of their own institutional activity, and this was a paradox and an avant-garde museum. And another example we could quote here, this is the Museum International, created with Zdenke Bodanovets. So the union of big radical museums which try to auto-organize themselves for good purposes. What do you think? Is it possible to auto-organize institutions, and is it possible to use such infrastructure, or it is too complex and it is better to go down from bottom to the top?
No, I think those are really good examples of really, well, they're two different. I mean, the kind of productivists and the kind of situation in the 20s with Lunacharsky and so on had support of various kind of major innovations that were lasted for a while, and they were really important. They were very important models, by the way, for us in the 60s and 70s in art language and the early conceptual art. I mean, the Russian productivists really were just so powerful as models for us at that time. The second example of Museum International, it's true, Zdenka and all the other museum directors, Vasif Kotorn, and people all around the world working at museums of contemporary art in small places, not in the main centers, connecting all those together. What she was doing, if you like, was operating laterally around the world, sideways within the exhibitionary complex. She was working against the top-down, concentrated imperial center Western model towards the peripheries of old colonial, disasters. So that top-down model. So what she was creating was an international lateral series of support structures. Okay, And similarly, Maria Lindt, at the same time, she created another international network of alternative spaces, like the Kunsthal, where she was director in Sweden. And she created another international network. And then eventually she did a biennale where she invited those people, and that was her biennale. Well, she also had an exhibition of artworks, but the main point of her biennial was to create a meeting. And so you have a kind of horizontal movement. And another example, in Australia, we have, in fact, 74 artist-run initiatives throughout Australia. They have their own organisation. They meet each other every year and so on and so forth. And at every level of the complex, there are actually lateral organisations. So that whole diagram with those 5 points, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points interacting with each other, and also power going down like this and power pushing up like this. Horizontal, there's a horizontal structure of operation. But these are initiatives that became necessary because of the incredible size of the exhibitionary complex. Because compared to the 60s, when I started in the art world, this is like 300 or 400 times bigger. I mean, this is just massive in terms of the numbers of people and places. I mean, 3 or 4 times, 3,000 times bigger. It's incredible. But in principle, it's the same, to work against power coming down against you. And particularly, it's not that the people who are rich and wealthy are imposing a viewpoint, particularly on you. It's that their governments are withdrawing funding from you. I mean, so neoliberal governments, governments gave up during the 2000s, during the globalization period, which thank God is just finishing now in some disarray. But during the period of high globalization in the last 20 years or so, what governments were doing were privatizing everything, including local government operations, and making local, local governments have to, I'm not sure what happened in Russia, but who knows, maybe I'll be surprised if it was any different. Even local art organizations had to find their own external funding rather than get support from where they were getting a lot of support from local governments and local councils and people in the locality. That got cut off. So many of the examples you're talking about were people trying to survive and accommodate by supporting each other laterally around the world. Now I seem to have lost you. I need someone to tell me what's happening. There he goes. Hi. I think your sound is off.
Да.
Okay.
Прошу
Hi.
прощения, были проблемы
Excuse
со
me.
связью.
Yes, we had some issues with internet connection. We have been talking for 1 hour and a half. Do we have time for a couple of questions more, or shall we wrap up? What do you think?
I'm fine. I'll go as long as it takes. Yeah, no problem.
Окей. Хорошо, тогда еще
Thank
один
you.
вопрос.
In this case, one more question from the public about the strike and radical political gestures. Ivan Polezhaev is asking the following. Any active political position, opposition to the government, and if we talk about radicalism, it supposes the inclusive character and an exclusive character, and so this exclusivity is in counteraction with the inclusiveness of the art. Is it a problem? Is the radicalism the reduction of possibilities and refusing the connection to the objectiveness, or this radical position is a myth we need to criticize through our position. So I reformulated the question to make it more understandable. I hope that it worked.
Okay. So it really depends on whether you take radicalization to mean a radical practice in terms of artistic form, or whether you take radical to mean radical in the sense of politically transformatory of the world. Okay, so it depends which understanding of radical you mean. It's certainly the case that in the 70s, you know, in terms of work like art, language, and conceptual art, the early phases of conceptualism were committed to total transformation of the concept of art and the practice of art in and of itself per se finish as what. So you made a kind of art that was mostly invisible, had to be thought, had to rethink art as such. So in that sense, it was actually profoundly radical from the point of view of form and content and meaning compared to previous art. And then it got even more complex. But after a certain time, by the early 70s, in fact, we realized that we'd lost a connection with social practice, whether it was with actually transformatory social practice. We'd lost that. And you could no longer guarantee that a transformation within art would automatically operate as a transformation within society or within a culture. That was, the people were no longer so committed to artistic practice that they would feel a radical change in artistic form to be a change in their world. They no longer would feel that. And that's even more so the case today, I think. And we've got to the point where, on the one hand, we have artists like Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst and so on, producing baubles for the unbelievably rich that are a kind of joke about their total lack of taste, but they're sold for millions and millions of dollars. And that, in the public mind, stands for contemporary art. I mean, it's an absolute joke of the worst kind, awful rubbish. But on the other hand, you have artists and artist collectives and artists who are working in ways that are actually world transformatory. You know, they're connected with ecological issues, but they're also connected with ways of thinking about time in different sorts of manners. You know, I think we still need radical rethinking. We need to rethink thought. We need critical thought to be rethought, because in a curious way, thinking differently about time and the nature of being and so on and so forth, that kind of thinking is necessary to be able to picture a world beyond the disasters, you know, a world beyond, you know, let's solve climate change by going up 1.5 degrees rather than 2, and, you know, reducing everything becoming captured by, I mean, we have to deal with all that. It's absolutely necessary to deal with it, but it's going to reduce the possibility of futures and ways of being in a radical sort of way. So I'm going slightly off your question, but I hope you understand why I'm doing it. I'm wanting to say that it's necessary to continue a practice of radical rethinking of artistic form, right? But not in a way that you think will guarantee that you'll produce something of value. There are no guarantees anymore, and it's not an either or choice anymore. In fact, it hasn't been for the last 40 years, that choice, I don't think. So that's an answer.
Есть несколько сразу вопросов,
There
которые
are several questions that are linked to um, what you were talking about now, and they relate to democratization of the exhibitory and curating complex on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are linked to the necessity to make experiments and to educate, to have a political function. And this is one of the functions of museums. And the questions relate to the following: how can we find balance between the openness to spectators and the understanding of the fact that a museum or an exhibitory complex has another function um, except attracting as many visitors as possible. So how can we keep this balance between the fact that the contemporary art until today, and especially if we talk about such countries as Russia, so contemporary art is a practice for elites, and it is but at the same time, museums could be open for everyone and are not doing populism. So what is the balance? What do you think?
Yeah, so there isn't a balance, okay? There's no ideal. There isn't a balance in anything. So why should there be a balance in this particular situation? So there's not a balance. What was happening was before COVID, there was actually a saturation. There was actually a situation occurring where the complex was winding itself up in such a way is that in the Museum of Modern Art, in the Metropolitan Museum, for example, they were having to take down artworks to leave enough space for all the people who were pressing into the building. There's so many people coming in, and this happened also in the Louvre, where the guards basically said, we can't breathe. I mean, the air is just impossible. There's so many people. You're letting all these people come in. So COVID, in a sense, COVID did for museums something it's doing to the world in general, like massively reducing the population. Doesn't take a lot of, you don't have to be a rocket science to understand why COVID has appeared at the moment, given the way global capitalism has fucked up international arrangements and generated this massive inequality, economic and political cultural inequality. What will fill gaps like that are in fact diseases, pandemics, and wars. Usually that's how it's dealt with. Thank God we haven't got a world war. We have many particular wars going on. But sorry, I'll go back specifically to the question. It is crucial to open museums and open them in a way that will not just attract as many people as possible, but actually integrate them to educational structures and to satelliting and to working through communities. Not just, see, at the moment, most museums, including, say, Garage, for example, which is a terrific museum of its kind, outstanding in the world terms of its kind. And I know it makes efforts to, excuse me, reach out to distant places, cities, Ekaterina or some, I'm not sure. So it has some satellite activities, one or two, okay? And it's got to have a lot more. So it's also to work against the elite aspect of it. It's got to do, like, for example, in Pittsburgh, where I'm in the Carnegie Museum of Art, we developed a sort of art lending library in a local area. It's a very poor black area, really devastated industrial area, where there was a library, in fact, created by Andrew Carnegie in the 19th century. That was the sort of social hub for this small city, this suburb, and we created a sort of art lending library where people there could borrow works of art by very famous international artists like Andy Warhol and artists who are in the international, Carnegie International, lent works to be borrowed like books by the local people. And some people went in there and facilitated that activity, made it. And it was actually, I've been there. It works. It really works. You've got kids from local high school borrowing, Anne Hamilton work or, stuff like this to take to their school and bring it back a few weeks later. It's fantastic. So, there are things you can do of that kind that distribute the power and distribute the energy of the exhibitionary complex. Make it more public. So that's why I spoke. One of the great energies is the public need and desire for art. They don't have to actually learn the history of art and know it, like an art history graduate student, or and they don't have to recognize all. And there are whole bunches of ways in which artistic practice works. And I think that's going to happen a lot more. The moment museums still were divided into here's the curators and here's the educators, right? That's, again, a mistake. That's, I think, hopefully slowly changing. But also in the United States, we have a very particular challenge along these lines. It's not just elite versus the masses. The country is a race war going on. I mean, in the United States, there's a race war going on. I mean, this is serious, deeply, we have a kind of almost a civil war between those who still voted for Donald Trump and people who voted for Biden and other people. Well, the country's almost on the verge of a civil war, a cultural civil war. And you saw on January the 6th, they can actually generate this ridiculous. I mean, these are people who actually struck. They not only went on strike and made a march, but they actually hit the Capitol and took the building over with no plan about how to run the country afterwards. I mean, it's the most stupid upside down piece of political interventions you could ever imagine. But anyway, but that's fairly typical of the kind of, the primitive level of the politics of the Trump and his supporters. But anyway, so on the one hand, you've got a civil war operating, but there's, more importantly, there's a race war, and that's emerging just because of how thoroughly badly government, mainly by whites in the United States, has treated African Americans, created this great incarceration system, and poverty and so on and so forth. So that, if museums are going to, or galleries or even art spaces, the whole complex has to become anti-racist in the United States. And in fact, some bits of it are. Our museum, the Carnegie Museum, is doing a bunch of things to shift this building designed by Andrew Carnegie, for God's sake, in the late 19th century, to actually shift out of that building and shift into communities to be constructive in this situation of massive racial division that's dividing the country. Much worse, I think, even than in Russia, I'm sure. But so again, all these answers to the questions depend very specifically on the context that they're operating in, I think. Yeah.
Спасибо. Сейчас, наверное,
Thank you. Now we can talk about the transformation of art related to the mass movements in the USA, but there was an absolutely fantastic story with the Library of Art, which can be borrowed home. That's the first time I've heard about it, and it sounds just incredible and absolutely amazing. I remembered an example of Soviet avant-garde museologists. There were two important futuristic figures, Nikolai Pruning and Osip Brick, who
Yeah.
worked
Yeah.
in the museum department, and they suggested a concept of a museum as a library where you can visit, move the works around
Ah,
from one shelf to another. So
yeah.
these ideas are very revolutionary indeed.
Mm.
I wanted to ask a question about the time and history. It seems that this is one of the central issues, and your methodology has to do with contextualizing and historizing certain artistic phenomena. And your thoughts on contemporary are also very interesting. Your views of it as a certain collage of temporalities of various historical elements. And the category of history and time is very important. But you, in your books, for instance, in Art to Come, remembering your meetings with Derrida, are mentioning these something that is similar to when we are falling in love or when
Ah,
we are feeling the difference of the other. And you are also speaking about a similar feeling that the work of art evokes in us. For a moment, we feel an insight. We feel it's that it is out of time. Um, Perhaps it is a moment of utopian overcoming. And there is also the fact that we have to live with the history that was written by the winners, and very often from the position of the oppressors. And after the events in the USA, we are hearing ideas of throwing art history away or making it as open as possible. For instance, Claire Bishop suggests a new vision of the art history. She preserves this concept but opens it to all the post colonial interventions and tries to make it the history of histories. And my question is this: can we imagine in some utopian perspective the art that will overcome time? We can also mention the concept of Russian cosmism that understands the value of the history of the past, but also um, speaks of a certain tool that should liberate us and at a certain point lead us to a situation of liberation from time. Do you think whether such a vision of art is possible? Perhaps it's an utopia.
okay. It's a big question. Maybe my answer will be the last one because I get a little tired now. But I will make this statement. So utopia is already here. Okay. But it's only part of our present. It did not arrive as a whole. Okay. It's not a future that's occupied all of the present. It's just moments that can be experienced in many contexts, um, including in response to works of art, but also in response to people and groups of people and settings and places in the world. Okay? So you can have utopic time, or time I think that is out of historical times and not messianic time. In other words, it hasn't been delivered to us by the Messiah which is Walter Benjamin's hope. Walter Benjamin in the thesis in the philosophy of history had this great wish that he was writing to historians. That is an essay for historians to read, not everybody, but for historians. And he said, historians should not count time like a series of beads on a necklace, as if they're in a church, doing their beads, or in a temple, counting their beads. They should recognize that history appears as a shock. It throws itself up to us. So a dialectical image, by which he meant the dialectical operations of history appear to us as an image. They become an image. And many works of art, most really good works of art, I think, generate that sense in us. They particularly if they've been grounded or inspired in some kind of history. What's effective about Guernica as an artwork is that it's not that it's to do with bombing or pictures, women and soldiers and so on and so forth. It's what's effective about Guernica is that it's too big in some ways for its own subject. There's a disjunction between the things you're seeing inside the painting and the ostensive, the subject is there, which is the subject about a world becoming impossible. Right? So it's a dialectical image. That painting is in fact a dialectical image. It's a sort of an eruption. It's difficult to explain. You've got to be there and see it happening to you. You can feel it happening to you. I'm just trying to visualize and give some substance to this concept. I always, a lot depends on the frame that you have before you even ask the question, the sense of what temporalities are that you have. For example, if you were St. Augustine, you would make a distinction, as he says, he thinks about the past is present times in the past. The only way we can think about the past is as if we were in the past, like as if we were in the present of the past. And the only way we can think about the future is if we were there in the future. The only way to think about the present is as if it happened to us, as if it's happening to us now. So if you think about his idea of past, present, and future as three different presents, three different ways of being in the present, he was talking about how human possibility to understand time is locked into imagining it as if it was happening to us in the present. Right? Whereas eternal time, or the time of where God exists, or the time of saints, is a time that transcends that limitation we have. We can only see presence. Now, to me, that's a limited. Many people might not necessarily have that specific view, but they have a view about time where someone else has the power to define what good time, or time you want to be in, utopic time is. Someone else has that power. Either the future, or a political structure, or a god, or a set of gods, or a church, or something, something else has that power. Only something else has that power. So, but if that's the case, it's always going to be delayed. It's never going to arrive, I think, if that's the case. Okay, so anyway, these are slightly abstract thoughts, but as you know, you gave me the chance to write a little bit about Walter Benjamin and Hannah Arendt and Franz Kafka, who has this wonderful parable called He, about how we're always in a state like Sisyphus, that we're always pressed from the future, squeezed from behind, and we always hope that we can escape time to get to another place. But he was very cunning. He said, we only hope we can escape so we can adjudicate the time for other people. We can somehow determine the time of other people. That to me would be an unethical way of wanting a utopia. So anyway, but the main way I'm trying to frame an answer to you is to suggest that because we're now in a condition which I'll call a condition of contemporaneity, where we only have other kinds of time available to us and the time of others around us, and our own personal time or our own subcultural times are themselves very various and multiplicitous. Doesn't mean they're chaotic. There's actually relatively few of them, but they're there. There are many of them, and they're not all moving forward. Some of them are definitely recursive. Some of them holding back other kinds of time. Right? So they all have different, if you like, bodily shape and movement, and they all, but they're all kind of existing together. And the big difference is that none of them now offer the possibility of rescue, in the sense that religious, the Messiah will come, or Christ will come, or the communism will finally arrive, or whatever. So we've only got, but we do have all these vast millions of people not able at the moment to work together on anything, but we have many collectives, small-scale collectives, and we even have the figments of international governance. In the United Nations, we have fragments of international governance, and we even have a few self-interested businesses who don't want to destroy the world fully, only want to destroy a bit of it. So we have possibilities. We have international organizations, and we have some those horizontal structures like the Museums International and Maria Linz, and we have Biennale Founder. We actually have lateral connectivities, all of which are creating the kind of lineaments, the lineaments of a future of a world that's I hope will be a kind of coeval commons. And for me, it's very hard to actually specify and except by pointing to bits and pieces, fragments. So it's like fragments of the utopic, but not the utopic at the moment as an entire state, as a whole, as if it's a heaven, as if it has a landscape, as if it was a place. It can't be a place by definition, but it always wants to be a place, So it's more about location. Anyway, these are abstract thoughts, but abstractions are concrete. In our circumstances, we need these kind of thoughts, I think. Anyway, there you go.
Спасибо, Терри, спасибо
Thank
большое
you very
за
much, Terry. Thank you very much for your lecture and for this conversation. I think that it was very inspiring, and that will lead to many thoughts. And in our Russian context, it is very important. We thank you, and we hope to see your future publications in Russian and to hear to your future presentations.
Okay, Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks everybody for listening. Okay. I'm off now. Okay. Bye.
До свидания.